Hi, my name is Nick McCallum and you're listening to the interview that I had with Alain Goodman on Gogoodman.com.au. Let's fire it up.
Hi, everybody.
Does everybody know what time it is?
It's go time.
Radio is theatre of the mind.
When I started, I used to do Frank Spencer of all people. You know, like,
Really? I didn't think I'd make it here tonight.
My first game was on John Worsfold. He was a killer, a brute, pretty old school, back when football was football.
That's a whole nother topic.
Now, Ralph, I can rattle off a ton of them. There's a leprechaun. He tells me to burn things. I'm Idaho. When I grow up, I want to be a principal or a caterpillar.
Go Goodman. Go Goodman.
Go Goodman.
Hey man, this is Austin St. John. I played Jason, the original Red Ranger.
Hi, I'm Karen Parsons. I played Marie Banks on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
hi, I'm Russell Gilbert.
Hi, I'm Piper Norris. I'm double to Jamie Alexander on NBC's Blind Spot.
Hi, I'm John Michael Howson.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Cherry, Australian sports broadcaster.
Yibba folks, this is Rex Hunt. I love all things fishing and football.
Hey, this is Nancy Cartwright. You might recognize me as Hi, I'm Bart Simpson. Who the hell are you?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. Listen to the Alain Go Goodman Show.
The Alain Go Goodman Show.
With Alain Goodman.
With Alain Goodman.
You're listening to Alain Goodman.
Because it's a good show.
That's right. Good afternoon and welcome to the Alain Go Goodman Show for the 19th of June 2016. We've got a jam-packed show for you today. I've got one of the most experienced broadcast journalists in Melbourne sitting right opposite me, and he's staring at me with a big smile. So I'm looking forward to interviewing him. His name is Nick McCallum, and we're going to pit him against, in a light debate, which we've never done on the show before, against one of the regulars on the Alain Go Goodman Show, one of the show favourites, Dave Smith, the sports god. We'll get him on the phone a little bit later after we've had a chat to Nick, and it's going to be a very fun show. So stay tuned, and we'll get it up and running in just a moment. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Alain Go Goodman Show. I've been looking forward to this one for a couple of weeks now. I've had it all lined up, and it's time to kick straight into it so we can get through everything we've got planned. Nick McCallum, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Alain. What an amazing opener. I don't know whether to call you Alain, Go, or Goodman, or Mr. Goodman.
Well, I added the extra go for dramatic effect, so I think it works.
It is. No, fantastic opener, and it's great to be here.
Let's kick straight into it. You're not tired at all. You've just come off the air a couple of hours ago in the city at your own station. We'll say 3AW, big station in Melbourne. How are you feeling? All good? You found the place okay?
Yeah, no problems at all. I ended up having to go to my other job, my real job at Channel 7 for a while to put together a story for tonight's news, and then came down here, no problems at all. Great.
And I was just talking to the tech guy before. We saw a blue Mini drive past before, and I was saying, oh, God, please don't let serious guy Nick McCallum drive a blue Mini.
What have you got against minis?
Nothing. I just don't imagine. I imagine you. Carl, the tech guy, he said he thinks Nick's a bit more of maybe a Mercedes man. I think he may not be that. For lack of a better term, cock. I was thinking maybe like a BMW, maybe a nice Holden kind of guy.
No, yeah, run-down old Peugeot, about 150 years old. I'm not a car person. I'm going to be totally honest. Not a car person. As long as the bloody thing gets me from A to B, I really don't care. Yeah, I know a lot of people are into cars, and if you're into cars, God love you. But as far as I'm concerned, all I need a car for is to get from A to B. The sooner I can get out of the bloody thing, the better.
Yeah, rip out the bottom and just use your legs to do it as well, yeah?
Yes, and do the Fred Flintstone.
Yeah. So, I read that you wanted to be a journalist from a very young age. You had that mindset from your teenage years. Who were some of the journalists or broadcasters that you grew up with? Well,
when I was a teenager, of course, it was Darren Hinch. Neil Mitchell had just started doing bits and pieces for 3AW, but Darren Hinch was the big one. He initially started at 3XY and then went on to 3AW. And he was great because as a youngster, and he still does it, as a youngster, you would listen to him and he would equal parts delight you and equal parts frustrate and annoy you. And I think that's the great sign of a great broadcaster, because no one in your life no one in your life, whether it be your mother, your father, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever, no one you agree with 100% of the time. And the great thing about Darren is he is often unpredictable. And the great thing about Darren is you know where he's coming from, and he will not beat around the bush, and he'll always give you a straight opinion. So I used to listen to him quite a lot. A few of the old traditional 3AW people I used to listen. My parents were huge 3AW fans, so wherever we went in the car, we'd be listening to 3AW. So often you'd hear Mary Hardy, Jeff Mannion, Ormsby Wilkins, all those real sort of classic old-fashioned broadcasters from the 1960s when I was growing up, and I fell in love with it. Just loved it.
Were your parents around when 3AW first started in 1932?
No, they were both born, funnily enough, in 1932.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
Wow.
they were both born in 1932. But they were real radio. My mother in particular, she grew up in the country, and when she was growing up, it was a very traditional thing for the whole family to sit around the radio at night and listen to the old radio serials. It was a very country thing to do in those days. So she had an ingrained love of radio, and she was never short of a word herself. So it was always something that she insisted on doing. We'd always listen to 3AW in the car or at home, and she still does it, mind you, and she's now 84.
You mentioned Darren Hinch, and you said he'd always say it straight no matter what it was. These days, sometimes broadcasters can get in trouble for doing that. Was that a big issue at the time, speaking your opinion?
Not really. I mean, and to be honest, there's a lot of, and it infuriates me at times, Elaine, because a lot of people jump up and down and say, political correctness is destroying our free speech. Well, it's not. You can say, particularly as broadcasters, as long as it's reasonable argument and as long as it's not defamatory, which is basic, and as long as it doesn't incite violence against anyone, you can say what you want. Now, if you expect to be able to say what you want and not have anyone to criticise you, well, that's not this country and never has been. But you can basically say, I get it all the time. All these people send me emails, send me tweets, and often ring up on the radio station and say, we can't say what we want. Well, what do you want to say? And they go ahead and say it. And at the end of their rant about whatever it is they don't like, whether it be, Muslims or, a racial group or whatever, they go on a rant and say, I would love to be able to say A, B, C and D. And you say, well, you know what? You just have. No one is here stopping you at all. But if you expect you can come on this radio station or you can send this email and have me just cop it and not come back at you and say that's a ridiculous thing to say, you're in the wrong country. So it's an excuse. To blame political correctness for not actually saying what you think, I think is an excuse, and it's a chance for people just to dismiss people and say, that of course is political correctness. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear your argument against it. More than happy to hear your argument against it every time.
And we're off and running. No wonder my email, you couldn't reply to my email for a week. It got lost in the hate mail.
Yeah. Look, you get that all the, and that's part of it. I mean, and that's one of the great joys of talkback radio. It is fantastic. I love hearing people's opinions, and I love having people calling up, and I love people disagreeing or agreeing or whatever. And I appear with someone else who's been a guest on this show, and that's John Michael Housen, and we intrinsically disagree with everyone or each other all the time, but we've both been in this industry a long time. Him, in fact, a lot longer than I have, and we know that at the end of the day, it's a radio show. And we are having a debate. And at the end of the day, you walk out and say, see you next week, and that's it. Unfortunately, some people take it a little bit more seriously than that, and they end up, sending emails and all of that sort of stuff. And you think to yourself, hang on, it is a radio show. The whole idea is to have a debate. If it gets a bit fiery, all the better. But don't expect us to walk out the door and continue it. No, he's off somewhere. He often goes off to buy dim sims for his dog. I go home to my family, go to the football, whatever, and we start all again next week.
Now, you've mentioned the Australian broadcasters. I know there wouldn't have been as much access to international broadcasters as well. Did you ever get into American radio or British radio?
A little bit. We actually lived in Los Angeles for 7 years, so I spent a lot of time listening to American talkback radio, and It is a very different beast.
Well, as like a teenager growing up.
Not as a teenager. No, as a teenager growing up. No, I'm moving. I'm sorry, but when I went and worked there, I listened a lot. But as a teenager growing up, no, I used to see quite a bit of American news on in those days. American news and British news used to feature quite predominantly on our local news bulletins. So I saw a bit on television, but no, I never listened to it on radio. In those days. Foreign news, and remember, I was a kid in the late 1960s, so it was all about, in those days, the Vietnam War. So we'd see a lot of American reports, a lot of British reports about the Vietnam War. And I remember my mum saying when I was a kid, when she was growing up, she thought once World War II finished, there'd be no news at all because everything used to be about World War II. I felt the same way about the Vietnam War. When I was a kid growing up, every news bulletin, understandably, was about the Vietnam War. And I used to think to myself, well, once that finishes, there's never going to be any news.
You're born and bred in Melbourne. You're a Melburnian, Victorian. How did you crack into the commercial journalism scene in such a competitive city?
Oh, well, it was...
Because you're a journalist, first of all. Before a radio broadcast, you're a journalist.
Yeah.
So how competitive was that industry when you got in?
Well, I was just lucky. It was very different in those days. Nowadays, you have to do exceedingly well in VCE, then you have to get into a course, and then you can be considered for jobs and cadetships and all of that sort of stuff. When I was doing it, basically you go straight from school, and it was a cadetship, which is like an apprenticeship. And I was very, very lucky because I had finished school at the end of 1978. I hadn't even got my results yet. And Brian Naylor, your older listeners may remember, Brian Naylor left Channel 7 and took a couple of senior reporters with him to go to Channel 9. And it created a huge problem for Channel 7. And they basically, I'd already applied for a job there and told, no, there's nothing going. Then I got a call sort of just after I left school, just after I finished my then HSC exams, and was told, come in and see us. And I just walked in. They basically said, when can you start? Finish my exams, can start tomorrow. Okay, that's fine. We just need someone who can start straight away as a cadet. So I was very lucky. Just a vacancy happened. I had a friend who was already working there, so I walked in the door as a 17-year-old cadet.
Peter Mitchell wouldn't have been there that early. You'd be a similar age to him. So who was the generation before that you went into, and who were the big guns when you walked in?
Well, but just incidentally, Peter Mitchell started as a cadet at around about the same time, maybe a year or two before me, at Channel 9. So he was corresponding to me at Channel 9 when I was at Channel 7. Mel Walden was the newsreader. He'd just taken over from Brian Naylor. The reporters were Dermot O'Brien, who ended up becoming the news director at Channel 10. Charles Stewart was a senior reporter. Russell Street, Mike Barrett, Alistair Patterson, who ended up becoming an MP, a Liberal Party MP. He was also a reporter there at the time. Marianne Latham, Pamela Graham, who actually lives around this area, and was probably one of the first female reporters to really crack it big time in TV in Melbourne. She was probably one of the most senior reporters there, and she was terrific. And I learned a lot from all of them. And in those days, there was no mucking around. When you were the cadet, you were there to be sort of pushed around and shoved in the right direction, and you learnt by your mistakes. And people didn't hesitate in telling you what mistakes you'd made, and that helped because obviously you learnt the hard way, but you also learnt how to cope with what we now have to cope with every day, and that is someone telling you you're screwing up.
So do you think it was good for you not having that community radio or country television or country newspaper experience and just going straight into the big time?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. Yeah. Yes and no. When you say straight into the big time, you start as a cadet, and that basically means you did some pretty mundane sort of things, like listen to the police radio. You went through, and though, of course,
that would have been fun.
Well, it's funny you say that. I mean, everyone's well, that would have been fun. You've got to remember, 99% of police work is, to be honest, pretty boring. It's pretty mundane stuff. It's just checking things out. Maybe, you get called to a house where something may have happened, but it turns out to be a barking dog. So you actually
watch too much Cops.
You've watched too much Cops, and you think that every day is exciting. But for the average cop, it's not turn up to a murder or to a drug deal and catch the bad guy straight away. I mean, and that's why I admire police so often, because it is a hard gig. And it takes a lot of time, and 99% of their job is persistence, and it is just turning up constantly. So you used to have to do that sort of stuff. It was before the days of online, so you used to actually have to physically read country newspapers from all around the state. You used to have to go and get the boss's coffee, the boss's lunch, all that sort of stuff. So it wasn't really the big time. The one thing, though, was in those days they had a local late news. So if there was a late breaking story that was going to happen after the general news time, which at that time was 6:30 till 7, they'd send the cadet out to do a story, and you'd also have to work on weekends to try and and that's when you'd do stories, and that was the great advantage. You know, maybe it might have been better to go through community radio and country TV, and I know a lot of people have done it that way, and their training was fantastic. The one thing I will say, though, when you start off as a cadet in city television, it means that you are taught by people who have been in city television, and they teach you what city television wants. A lot of people who come from the country have to be sort of almost retrained and said, well, that's fine for the country, but this is what we want in the city. But, you know, you take it, mate, you don't get a choice. You take what you're given, and you make the most of what you're given.
So that's all TV at Channel 7. When did radio come?
Well, I actually left Channel 7 when I was fairly young and went to Canberra, and went to Canberra and worked for Channel 7 there, and then went to Channel 10, and then spent a bit of time at Channel 10 in Canberra and Melbourne, then went to Channel 9 in Melbourne, Los Angeles, the Today Show.
Yeah, so Channel 9's when you got shipped overseas.
Yeah, when I went overseas, and then came back, went to the Today Show, did a year at Fox Footy, and then came back to Channel 7. So all over the place, basically. So it was one of those lucky things. When I was in LA in 1994, I'd just arrived there, and the afternoon host, a name that would be familiar to a lot of your listeners, the afternoon host had just got the gig at 3AW as now doing what Dennis Walter does, and her name is Sarah Henderson. She is now the member for Corangamite in the Liberal government. She was an old friend of mine. We in fact were cadets together at Channel 7, and she rang and said, I've just got the gig doing the afternoon show at 3AW. We want to cross to America once or twice a week. Can you do it? And sure, no problem. So I'd get a phone call during the summer. It was 20 to 8 at night. During the winter, it was 20 to 10 at night. And so I'd get the phone call, and we'd just do a summation of what's happened during the week. When she was replaced by Ernie Sigley, it became 4 times a week. And when I came back in early 2001, Steve Price was then the program director at 3AW, and he said they had an issue with the bloke who was filling in for him over summer during the year when he was doing Drive, and he said, "You want to have a shot at it?" And I said, "Sure." No problems. And at that time, someone had just left the Sunday morning show, so I started filling in then. He said, we'll do both and see how it all works out.
You skipped all the warm-up that us kids have to do these days, hey?
Yeah, well, that's right. But, it's one of those things, though, that... when I was in LA, I basically had 7 years of warm-up doing the initially once a week and then 4 times a week and all of that sort of stuff. But... as I say, there is no right or wrong way of doing it. You just do what is handed up to you, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And the jury is always out. And that's what's great about this industry. It's a very subjective industry, and the jury is always out as to whether you're acceptable or not, and you're always one step away of being told you're boring and get out of here. It's just the way it is.
I've heard an interview with Peter Mitchell a little while ago. I'm not sure where I heard it, but one of the things was he was talking about the first time when he was maybe in his early 20s when, as a journalist, he saw, I think it may have been his first dead body, or when he went to his first murder scene or things like that. So I want to ask you, what are some of the firsts that have had an impact on you mentally?
A couple of things. When I was a young cadet, I must have been about 19. We had a night with the Ambos going around Melbourne, and we ended up at a car accident. It must have been 3 or 4 in the morning on Alexandra Avenue, and it was a car full of 17 and 18-year-olds who had left a party to go and get some more booze, and clearly the driver was going too fast. They lost control. They slammed into a tree. One of them, we arrived there in the ambo. So we got there before everyone else. And so we found one of them, unfortunately, had been thrown. He didn't have seatbelts on, thrown out the window about 100 metres away and sort of dead on impact. The second one had actually lost his arm and was bleeding to death in front of us. And I was 19. And you sit there and you go into work mode. That your defensive mechanism is you go into work mode and you immediately sort of say, this is what we're going to do. And I remember one of the ambo guys, very experienced guy that we were with, actually picked up the arm that had been severed and actually sort of walked up and put it in the ambulance on ice and said, we've got to save this. Sadly, this poor kid, I found out subsequently he was 17, ended up, they got him to hospital alive, which the ambos said was quite an achievement, but sadly he passed away. That sort of stuff sticks with you forever. That was when I was 19, so that must have been 35, 36 years ago. I can still remember it like yesterday. When I talk about it, I can remember those pictures and those images. That has a huge impact on you, the way you do your job, but it also has a huge impact on me, the way I subsequently drove and the horror I have every time my own sons get in a car and you think, they sort of laugh at me because every time they get in the car, I say, please be careful. And they look at me and say, oh, you silly old fool, But that's why. And that sort of has an enormous impact on you. I also, around about the same time, went to a light plane crash out of Clonbinane, which is near Broadford. And I might describe that because it was just horrendous, but suffice to say 5 people died in that plane, and it was in the days before the police set up proper cordons and all of that sort of stuff. We arrived there in a crew, and we were only a couple of metres away from the wreckage. So, and those sort of things stick with you forever. You never get over those.
What keeps you in the job then?
Well, because first of all, you don't do that every day. I think it's important to have done that if you end up doing those stories, because what that does, even though nowadays you're kept miles away, even though that still plays in your mind whenever, God forbid, you end up at a car accident or a plane crash, you have those images in your mind, and it influences your reporting. And I think that's really important to handle everything so sensitively, because you know what that scene's like. And that's really, and you can't even begin to imagine what it's like for the families that are involved in that. And so it's really important to keep that in your mind when you are reporting that, because you're talking about a family tragedy. And you're talking about not just the people who have died, but probably dozens of their friends and family whose whole lives are now totally screwed because of this incident. And I often fear that too many reporters nowadays have a gung-ho attitude towards that. And, think, oh, this is a great story, without thinking, hang on, there are dozens of people here whose whole life is screwed. We can't be gung-ho about this. We have to report it very sensitively. So that keeps that in mind. But also, you've got to remember, that's not the type of stuff that keeps you in the industry. The type of stuff that keeps you in the industry is the stories you enjoy doing, often more uplifting stories, but also stories that you try to do to try and make a change.
We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk to you about your time in America as a foreign correspondent. So we'll be right back on the Alain Go Goodman Show at 25 minutes past 2. Welcome back to the Alain Go Goodman Show. We're going to keep pushing along so we can get Dave Smith on the phone as soon as possible, but we've got plenty more questions for Nick McCallum, who's sitting right opposite me. Now, you were a foreign correspondent for Channel 9 in the 90s, from about 94 till you said about 2001.
Yeah.
Being a foreign correspondent, I'm always interested in learning about why you want to do it or whether you're told to do it. You were the American correspondent for Channel 9 for 7 years in the 90s. How hard is it to pack everything up, move your family to the other side of the world and completely change your lifestyle while moving straight into a whole new job? And the one I think of is Mike Amor, who's been over there for about 20 years. He's been over there for as long as I can remember. I can't imagine it would be easy for him to move back to Australia, and unless his kids are grown up, and just move back to an whole different lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, it was fun. I mean, when we went over to America, it was early in 1994.
Did you have your kids?
Yeah, I had one little boy who at the time was about 20 months old, and my wife, and I mean, nothing is easy with a 20-month-old kid. But
at least they're not in school or anything.
no, and enormous credit to my wife. As soon as she got over there, and we were talking about this actually just last night, as soon as she got over there, she took our little boy to a little play group, just a local play group with other kids around about the same age. And the people she met at that original play group, because she stood out, obviously she had an Australian accent, and going against the grain of LA is an exceedingly family-friendly place. And these women who all had kids about the same age immediately said to my wife, Elisa, you don't have family here, let us be your family. And the friends she made that day, which was only a couple of days after she arrived, ended up being our friends for the full 7 years and subsequent to that. And they were so fantastic and so kind. So that part of it was overcome. But it's a very exciting place. Los Angeles is a really exciting place, but America is a really exciting place. As we know, there is no such thing as a quiet day. And as a journo, it was just amazing. And that's why I enjoyed the radio part of it so much, because you do a news story for the news, it might run a minute and a half or whatever. But there was so much that happened around that news story that you couldn't actually put into that time. So radio, you can talk about the backstory, which was really a lot of fun and interesting. Obviously, a lot of issues when we were there. It was the Clinton presidency, and there was never a dull moment with Bill Clinton. I mean,
there's never been a dull moment since Bill Clinton.
No, there hasn't either. But, Bill Clinton was an amazing individual, and that if he hadn't have done those stupid things, his presidency would be considered a wonderful success, because economically it was a very strong time in America. The Balkans, he got involved in the Balkans, and what could have been a horrendous situation, he actually got in there and got down and dirty and actually fixed the problem, and he was the main negotiator in the Northern Ireland peace. Now, anyone else, you'd think, wow, what a great presidency, but then he did the stupid things with Monica Lewinsky and all the other bits and pieces, and he was always considered a little bit shonky. Own worst enemy at this stage. But it was a fascinating time. It was also the time of the 1996 Olympics, and the great thing about being in LA, which no doubt you spoke to John Michael about, is the Oscars. And it was a historic, we were out of pure luck, it was an historic time, because it was Shine, when Shine came through, and it created records for the number of Oscar nominations for an Australian film, and of course that great man Geoffrey Rush won the Best Acting Oscar, and he was the first. Peter Finch won an Oscar, and he was kind of Australian, but Geoffrey Rush was the first, dinky-die, fair dinkum true Australian actor to win an Oscar, and we were there, followed him all the way through from the moment he arrived in LA to promote Shine, all the buzz regarding Shine, and then winning it on the night and the party the following day. And it was just an amazing feeling to be part of it, because you had a feeling that history was being made, and it was. It was great.
You covered a lot of big stories and events, as you've just mentioned there, in politics, sport, entertainment. Are there other stories, big stories you remember from your American days? You saw Pat Rafter win a US Open or two?
Two.
Yeah,
two US Opens. And once again, he was had the touch of the Geoffrey Rushes about it, and that Pat is just a wonderful bloke. And as we have subsequently learned, there are not a lot of wonderful blokes in world tennis at the moment. But Pat Rafter was great, and what I loved about Pat is he was surrounded by members of his family. He came from a very large Mount Isa family, and they were no crap sort of family. And he surrounded himself with a family, and they kept him grounded, and he was fantastic. And he won 2 years in a row, so we were fortunate enough to be at 2 finals in a row, and that was fantastic. On the more serious side, there were some horrendous plane crashes. There was the TWA flight that crashed in 1996. About 230 people died on that. And there was also one in Canada as well, about 230 people. So going to those crash sites were experiences you wouldn't want to do again, but it was sort of horrendous, but that was all part of the gig. And I was also fortunate to cover the end of the 2000 election, when effectively Al Gore and George W. Bush effectively had a draw. And the 3 weeks after that, the machinations and the country literally, I mean, people forget, the country was frozen in time for 3 weeks because no one could figure out who had won. And it was a great test of the American democracy, and I've got to tell you, it answered the democracy pretty well. And, you know, in the end, I mean, Al Gore has probably still sort of tosses and turns at night because it was literally only a handful of votes between him and the presidency, and he missed out.
And the big story, obviously, from 2001 in America was September 11. You would have just missed out on that.
Yeah.
Do you regret that, or do you feel good that you weren't there during that time?
You're torn.
As a journalist,
as a
family man as well.
Yeah, well, that's right. As a journalist, I would have wanted to have been there to cover the story.
You can't say loved. You can't say loved to have been there.
No, you're right. You can't say love, but it was the defining event of our lifetime. So as a journalist, you wanted to be there, but as a father of, at that stage, 2 young boys and a beautiful wife, I was very pleased that we were back in Australia, because if I'd had to leave them in LA, and I spoke to a lot of friends who were in LA and in New York and all those sort of, and I mean, basically, war had been declared on the United States. No one knew what was going to happen. There were scares everywhere, right around the country. I would have been very reluctant to have left my family in LA at that time, and I was really pleased that they were out of it. But having said that, as a journalist, you would have loved to have been there. But I'd love, as you say, love's the wrong word. I would have wanted to have been there to have covered that story because it is the defining moment. And sadly, we're still getting the repercussions of that now.
Since then, you've mentioned you've filled in on morning shift and more recently on the afternoon drive shift on 3AW. Both of those shifts with Neil Mitchell and Tom Elliott, and before that, Darren Hinch, they're both serious news stories. Is there a difference between kind of demographic and how serious each show is? Did you prefer the mornings or the afternoons? What's the difference between those two slots?
Well, it's just what time you have to get up in the morning, basically. I mean, they're both very...
intensity wise.
Well, intensity, they're fairly much the same. I mean, morning is in... I'm not a very good morning person, I've got to be totally honest. So morning is always a bit tougher because you've got to get in there at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it does go a little bit longer. It's about 3.5 hours, whereas for many years when Darren was doing it, drive was 2 hours, and now it's 3 hours under Tom Elliott. The intensity is about the same. I find that when you're doing it on your own, whenever you finish, you sort of wander out there and you feel as though you've done 10 rounds with Mike Tyson, because there is just no relaxing. It is at you the whole time, not just because you have to prepare and know as much as you can about each story, but also and that's part of the joy. The callers come at you and you have no idea. I mean, people say to you all the time, oh, you rig the callers and you won't let certain people. Ladies and gentlemen, that does not happen. They come at you and you might have 3 or 4 words on the computer screen saying Alain has called and he disagrees with you on whatever it is, you know, immigration or the economy or whatever, and that's all you know. And they come at you and you have no idea what they're going to say. And like, as you can imagine, today we had someone coming at us who ended up ending up in some tirade of abuse and language, which we had to beep out, you know. But you have not, and that's part of the fun, but it is exhausting. So I find at the end of whether it be drive or mornings, I'm sort of absolutely beat, and you end up sitting in your seat afterwards and just flopping there and thinking, what the hell happened then? It's like being hit by a tsunami. But that's the fun of it, and that's why I really enjoy doing both. They are slightly different programs. The morning show, and this is Neil Mitchell's real sort of culture, and that is the morning show is all about breaking news, trying to break news, covering the news that's happening in the morning, and then drive often that obviously covers any breaking news, but also the idea is to do at start of every hour to have a strong, hard-hitting editorial to either, to fire everyone up, and then have breaking news intermitting that. So there's a slight difference, but basically it's the same principle. The same principle is to, whenever there's breaking news, state opinions, take calls, and the best show you can have is when you have everything planned, and as soon as it starts, you throw things out because there's breaking news and people call in. And as you know, when some people call in and say something either outrageous or tell you something new, people respond to it, and before you know it, the whole show's out the door, and you have no idea what you're doing. And that's part of it. I mean, that's the fun. That's what I love. I love nothing better than having to throw out a show.
So I find these days Neil Mitchell has kind of gone on a mission to kind of dilute the amount of politics there is today, but Tom Elliott doesn't seem to really care. He'll go straight into politics, but Neil Mitchell understands that people can get a bit sick of all this political jargon that's being thrown around. So that's why, I mean, there's a little bit of a difference. Neil Mitchell has a bit of entertainment. He has a lot of callers. He has a few lighter topics, but Tom Elliott's very serious, and he loves his finance. He loves his politics. So there's a little bit of a difference there these days. Yeah,
there is, but it's an individual thing, and that's something else I sort of deal with as well. There is no point if you're filling in, for over summer, say, for instance, there's no point in you doing exactly the same as what either Neil or Tom would do, because that's not being you. So when I do it, I try and do it a little bit differently, but obviously you still have the same guests on, you still have the same format, but you do try and do it a little bit, because there's no point. Neil Mitchell is Neil Mitchell. He is a legend. He's an institution. He's an icon. You can't pretend to be Neil Mitchell. You've got to be yourself. And it's the same with Tom. Tom is distinctive. He has his own style, and he is gradually becoming his own icon. He hasn't done it as long as Neil has, but he's going to, I think, because he's so well entrenched. And there's no point in me trying to pretend I'm Tom Elliott. I'm not. So, and people, I think, are realistic enough to know that if you're filling in, you don't have to have the same opinions. In fact, in many cases, it's probably better if you have a different opinion, because that way you get a variety of opinions, and people tend to call more if they disagree than if they agree.
Before we go to our next break, we can move through the last questions so we can get Dave on the phone.
Sure.
Have you ever felt nervous while covering a story on location? Nervous or threatened?
All the time.
Yeah?
All the time, yeah. I mean, you have... the nature of the gig is you find yourself in dangerous situations.
Have you ever been pushed too far, do you think?
No. Well, I mean, I sort of... Probably the best example is we went to Afghanistan a few years ago, and we were reporting... we were basically embedded with a group of Australian soldiers, and we were all sort of... helmets, body armour, all that sort of stuff in a vehicle surrounded by soldiers, and we were driving out on patrol. And, when you're young and little and you look at all of these things, you think, oh, wow, it's fun to be in it. But you're actually in there, in the vehicle, and then all of a sudden the door opens, and these troops sort of jump out, and they genuinely do the kneeling with the guns everywhere in their eyes there. And I looked at the cameraman and said, these guys are serious. They're expecting something serious to happen here. And all of a sudden it hits you, it's not a game. This is the real thing. And that was a good experience to have, because all of a sudden you suddenly think, hang on, I'm a, silly old bastard, I really shouldn't be here. But you feel an obligation to report that these guys, what they're doing, because they are doing an enormous job for Australia under enormously difficult circumstances and could get killed, so you have to report on that. So you do get nervous with those sorts of things. And of course, we always laugh in our industry, because invariably you end up flying to plane crashes, and while everyone else is running away from a bushfire, you run towards it. There are always dangers with that, and we are often arrogant and cavalier about those dangers, but we should never forget one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my career was losing four of my work colleagues and someone else in a helicopter crash in 1982 at Channel 7. And one of the people who died was the other cadet who was working at the time, a wonderful woman called Nicole Best. And there is a plaque to that crew at Channel 7, and whenever I go past it, I look at it and I think, if ever we get cavalier about what we do, just look at this. There were 5 people who turned up to work that day thinking, we're going to have a glorious day, we're going to fly by chopper to French Island and do a story there and come back. And they never came back. And we have to keep that in mind. It is an inherently dangerous job, and we can never take anything for granted.
So when does retirement come knocking on the door? You've been doing it 20, 30 years.
Elaine, let me tell you, unfortunately, I put through 2 kids through private school. I'm never going to retire. I have a mortgage that I can't jump over, so it'll be a little bit. And to be honest, I don't want to, because there are still, while there are issues with our industry in terms of the finances, lack of advertising in TV, online taking over, all that sort of stuff. If you can find stories you want to do, and I try and do as much of that as I can, find stories you want to do, find stories that interest you, and find stories that you think can make a change, it's great. It's still a lot of fun. And I find the biggest kick I get is being able to do a story that has an impact, even after 37 years. And there are days when you don't get to do that and you kick yourself and think, I'm too old for this. But most days when you do that, and I mean, I do a lot of stories on veterans and, Gallipoli and all of that sort of stuff. And when they have an impact, that's when you think, I still love this job, and there are days when I'm not too old for it. So retirement is not an option at the moment, I'm afraid.
And before we go to our next sponsorship announcement break, then we'll get Dave on the phone. We'll move things around a little bit. Do you prefer TV or radio, just quickly? What's the difference for you?
They're both so different that I can't... The great thing about radio is there is so much I do in day-to-day journalism that I can't talk about in day-to-day journalism. So radio gives you that freedom to expand and to give the backstory. So I think they complement each other. That's why I really enjoy both of them. And that's, you feel, every time I go out and shoot a story for Channel 7, I come back and think there is so much here that I can't say in a minute 30 or minute 40, which you get on the TV news. And I can't wait until Sunday morning so I can walk in the door and I can start blurting it out and getting attacked for saying it.
And you wait for getting attacked.
Oh, of course. But that's the nature of the gig. It's the nature of the Sunday morning show. When we get in there with John Michael, I start saying things and you just look at the look on his face and you can tell it's coming, and it does.
As I talked to you about before, I had John Michael Hauser on the show late last year, and he told me that you love a good tweet. And he hates the fact that you're always on your phone in the ad breaks or in the commercial breaks. How do you think social media has changed your job?
Oh, it's changed it dramatically, and no, I'm not on the tweeting machine every commercial break. It's just sometimes when he gets really cross at me, it's a lot easier just to look down and start looking at my phone rather than copying it in the commercial break as well. In day-to-day journalism, Twitter is a dramatic change because most of the time now, stories break on Twitter. And, whether it be people going past and seeing something, or whether it be news organisations like the Herald Sun, The Age, 3AW, when they get a story, their first way of getting it out is via tweet. And as a journalist, you simply have to listen to it. Now, and I agree with John Michael, Twitter often is a cesspool. And I have... One thing I have always lived by, that if you state an opinion and strongly, you put a name to it. And, you don't like the opinion, that's fine, come at me. I'm more than happy to stand here and defend my opinion. But what really concerns me about Twitter is that people use it as an opportunity to say the most disgusting, vile things about other human beings, and yet not have the guts to put their name to it. And I think that's incredibly gutless. If you don't have the courage to actually put your name or to say to me, to my face, you're wrong and this is why, well then, I don't think you're worth worrying about. Before we move on and find out where people can find you and hear your remarks on Twitter, you're a TV journalist. When people can go to Twitter or Facebook and get news instantly, how hard is it
to continue as a TV journalist that puts hours and hours of work into, as you said, a minute and a half article that'll be aired on the news when people have already read articles from around the world about it? Does that put a dent in your position?
Oh, look, yeah, I mean, you can argue both cases. I like to put the positive spin on it because it's my life and my career. I tend to think with television news, if you read about something, or if you hear about it on radio, read about it, if you can actually see the pictures of it. Like, to take a really simple example, if you hear on radio and read in the Herald Sun that Jesse Hogan has taken a spectacular mark, well, the first thing you want to do is you actually want to see the video of it, because everyone's painted this great picture that he climbed up, 5 stories and took an absolute hanger. You want to see it. And I think for television, because television can actually show you exactly what has happened. It can show you, the great mark. It can show you the politician crying into the camera. It can show you the politician looking very shady when he or she says something. So television has that ability. So often, if you read about something on social media or if you hear about it on radio, you will think, I must turn on the news and actually see what they're talking about, because then I can really gauge whether I think this particular politician is telling the truth or is lying, or how good a mark that was. So it can work together in complement each other, and I think that's really important for us to, as television journalists, to keep in mind that is the one thing that we've got. We've got the pictures, so let's pump those pictures and do stories that revolve around pictures and storytelling, because Twitter, for all its faults and all its good points, it's 140 characters, and that's what and that's another thing, and that's another bugbear I've got. The whole world,
whole other story.
The whole world thinks that your entire life is what you have just tweeted, which is 140 characters. So they assess your personality, and they assume they know everything about you from the 140 characters that you've just had, and you might have had a whole life of doing something. And you assess, and they just assess you on the 140 characters and say you're a lousy person, or even worse, you should die because of what you have just put on 140 characters. It's just ridiculous.
That's why I like doing interviews like this. You get a lot more than 140 characters.
You do.
Nick, where can people find you?
Well, I work at Channel 7 News. Most days sort of file for the 4 o'clock and the 6 o'clock news. I work at 3AW on Sunday mornings, and I'm filling in again for Tom Elliott on the week starting July the 4th, the week after the election, so that should be really interesting. And I have Twitter at Nick McCallum 7, and it's the figure 7.
And a final question. I know radio is a very important part in Melbourne culture and Melbourne society, and I've been into 3AW a few times and talked to a few of the long-running hosts and talked to them about the impact of radio in Melbourne. What makes radio in Melbourne different to anywhere in the world?
Well, it's a really good question, Alain. Because,
I'm glad I finished on it.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a really tricky one. I don't know I have the answer. But it is certainly really different. I mean, everyone talks about this, and it's very true. Talkback radio in Sydney is totally different to talkback radio in Melbourne. And I reckon, and here's my theory, talkback radio in Sydney is very much like talkback radio in America. And that is very much, in America and in Sydney, most of them are hard right-wing people, and you know what they're saying, and they take calls from people who support them as hard right-wing people. And, there are also some as well that are hard left, I might add, as well, and they take calls from hard left. And it is all the same people saying the same things and people ringing up and agreeing with them. In Melbourne, there is a culture of the hosts being a little bit more towards the centre, mostly conservative, but a little bit more towards the centre, and encouraging those who disagree with them to ring in. In America and Sydney, they don't like people disagreeing with them calling in, and very few actually get through. Whereas in Melbourne, there is a sense of, gee, it'd be fun if Alain called in and totally disagreed, and we can have a little bit of an argument on air, we can have a debate, and that adds to the interest. And I think that's what makes Melbourne a much greater radio town, because the hosts are prepared to have people who disagree with them come on, maybe give them a rocket or have a debate. And I love, when I'm driving around, I love to hear people ringing up and disagreeing with Neil or Tom or whatever, because it challenges us. And the most important thing is we've all got our hard and fast opinions, and most of us won't change them, but we need to challenge them all the time. And if you actually hear a good debate and you hear someone who disagrees with your point of view and you think, he's got a point, that's a good thing, because then you have to turn around and justify your own opinion, and you should always try and justify your own opinion because you need to think about it. And it gets people thinking. And that's the great thing about radio.
And that's why Australia's average life expectancy is getting higher. We're all thinking more.
Well, and that's right. And I mean, the great Rex Hunt, who I heard on your opener, always used to say, talkback radio is 90% passion. And he said that's the thing. If you believe something, go ahead and say it, and damn the consequences, and let people come back at you with just as much passion. And that's what it is. It's great.
Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure. Let's go out with a song that promotes love, Michael Jackson featuring Justin Timberlake, Love Never Felt So Good. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming in and going with my little debate with Dave. I thought it was fun. I thought it was a good test, something I've never done before, and something I can rewire and try and fix up a little bit, iron out the creases for next time if I want to do it again.
I think it was great.
Yeah, it's been fun. I look forward to the next 30 years of your career.
Thank you. Oh, God. And I reckon I'm tired now. Thank you for having me, Elaine. Good luck with your show. I think you're doing a great job.
Love Never Felt So Good. Michael Jackson featuring Justin Timberlake. It's 27 and a half minutes to 4. We'll be back soon with something from gogoodman.com.au. We'll figure something out. I'll be back shortly.
Dance. Let me see you move. Come on. Dance. Let me see you move.
Welcome back to the Alain Go Goodman Show. Dave, have we got you there?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear him now,
I
Nick?
can. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Oh, that's much better. I can hear both of you now loud and clear. Good.
Cool. So the first issue I want to touch on, I don't want to harp on it too much, is gun control. What can be done, and what did we do? Dave, I'm not sure if you know about our last mass shooting in 1996 with a guy called Martin Bryant in Tasmania. He went on a rampage and shot dead 35 people in Tasmania, and he got 35 life sentences. I want to know, Nick, what exactly did John Howard do? I know he took away all the guns, but what did he do?
Well, he didn't take away all the guns.
What did he do to control the gun violence?
Well, there were a number of things. He did sort of half a dozen things, but the number one thing was he made gun laws universal around Australia. So Tasmania had comparatively lax gun laws. He also made it very, very difficult without pretty tough permits to get an assault weapon, which was the type of weapon that...
And that was the AR-10, and yeah. I read that Martin Bryant was looking at the AR-15, which was the one that was used in Orlando.
Yeah, made it a lot harder, and also made it a lot harder to get... while you can, if you don't have a record, you can get pistols, you do actually have to basically be a member of a club, and he also introduced universally around the states as well, laws which mean if you have a gun at home, you basically have to lock it in a separate safe to your ammunition and all of that sort of stuff. So if you or I, without records, we wanted to get a gun, we could get a gun. We'd have background checks. We'd have to obey certain laws. But there's nothing stopping us getting guns. The whole point of it was to try and stop people who have either serious mental issues, criminal records, or whatever from getting their hands on guns.
Which has been an issue in America, am I correct, Dave?
Absolutely, yeah. With the latest mass killing in Orlando, Florida.
So... why do we don't have an association like the NRA, which apparently puts a lot of pressure on the American government to not change gun laws or to not enforce the gun laws that are apparently currently there?
Well, in Australia, I'll just explain, Dave, and then you can answer. Australia does have the Sporting Shooters Association, but it's certainly nowhere near as powerful, as influential, or as financially powerful as the NRA, and it doesn't have the political influence.
So why does the NRA have such a power in American politics?
Well, it's got a lot of members and it's got a lot of power within American politics, and it goes back to the purpose of the Founding Fathers when our Second Amendment says we have the right to bear arms, and that's an offshoot of the National Rifle Association. And I think and there's a couple of ways to look at it here. Criminals are going to get guns, whether they're legal or not. And you can look at it, if somebody were carrying in Orlando, if they had a security guard who was carrying, they probably could have stopped this guy before he killed too many people. Same with the school shootings going on here and the movie theater shootings. So you could say take all the guns away, or you could say if there was a security guard there or if somebody was carrying, they could have stopped him immediately. And a lot of times the narrative gets changed, at least here in America, where the single biggest problem we're facing right now is Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, not gun control. That's, I think, what we need to be laser focused on.
But Dave, I understand, obviously, Islamic State is a huge problem. But I also don't think you can look at what around about 13,000 gun deaths a year. You can't turn around and say that is not a problem we should be looking at.
Well, certainly it is, and I do think that I don't think anybody really needs an assault weapon. Guns and rifles, toning and carry permits, but I do think there need to be much stricter controls on assault weapons, and especially somebody this guy that killed people in Orlando at the nightclub shooting, he'd been under investigation by the FBI 2 separate times. He was under the watch of the FBI, and how he was ever allowed to get a gun is something that we need to really fix here, because that's ridiculous. Yeah, and
as I understand it, was it last year or the year before, there was legislation that went before Congress to ensure that people who are on watch lists for the FBI were not allowed to get these sorts of weapons, and it was voted down in the Congress because all of a sudden the FBI, which is beloved by so many people, all of a sudden when it comes to gun control laws, we can't trust them.
Yeah, and it's just it's going to slip through the cracks anyway. It is so easy to get a gun in America, whether through legal or illegal means. And there are certainly ways for criminals to get guns at all costs, no matter how many laws we pass. And
Dave, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the one thing I'm really interested in, I wanted to ask you. Donald Trump, one of the many things he said about this attack was just imagine what it would have been like if one of the members in this bar who'd been there, just a customer, had a gun and had been able to defend him or herself. I quiver at that, because in this particular incident, it might have been a good thing. But can you imagine overall, in all of America, if you enabled people to go into bars with concealed weapons, they get a gutful of alcohol, and then imagine the death toll over all of America if they get into fights and they turn into shoot.
Absolutely, and and I think that, again, we need to focus on a much bigger problem as well. With Donald Trump saying something like that, the other person running for President, Hillary Clinton, is for almost unchecked immigration from all countries, especially countries from the Middle East, and wants to let maybe 500,000 more people in, many of them Syrian refugees, many of them undercover and members of ISIS who are infiltrating the immigrant population. So that I think is a far greater problem we need to worry about here. Explosives, a city blowing up. We've got huge problems here if that happens.
I understand. This conversation could go on for hours, but we've got 3 more topics, and before we move on, I just want to say I've got a lot of American friends on Facebook, and I think one of the problems is this mentality that you're entitled to own a gun. We don't seem to have that in Australia, but there's this mentality that I can't quite grasp, that every suit in suburbia or every average person in metropolis seems to think they have a right to own a firearm. That mentality just doesn't exist in Australia, and that's what I don't understand.
Well, that goes back to the Second Amendment, and that goes back to the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution, where we were allowed to form militias and everybody was allowed to arm themselves and have weapons. And I have an uncle who lives in Texas, and it was funny that we bring this up. He told me the other day in his neighborhood, God, everybody on both sides of the street are all armed. They all have rifles. They all have guns. They're all concealed carry permits. And in 25 years he's lived there, there's never been one shooting. There's never been one problem. There's never been one killing. And it's because if you have law-abiding people with guns, you're not going to have a problem. It's the criminals who cause the problems.
Then when you say that it's the Second Amendment, it's based on a historical right, we talk a lot about, and I don't want to get myself in trouble here because I'll be the first person to admit I'm not great when it comes to politics, but we talk a lot about Muslim beliefs and Islamic beliefs and their laws, that they need to be upgraded, like stoning a homosexual person just because they're homosexual is not something you want to hear in 21st century. Do you think these gun laws need to be updated from the founding forefathers and back from the 1800s or even earlier? Is it something that needs to be updated?
Well, I think it needs to be updated in the fact that criminals and people on terrorist watch lists and people with records and felons it should be almost impossible for them to get a gun. I think that's the way it needs to upgrade for law-abiding citizens who haven't committed a crime. It has never really been a problem here in America. It's the criminals who are the ones killing people.
Look, I agree, but I'm a little bit like Elaine. I understand totally the right of an American to own a gun. What worries me is the right of American to own an assault rifle, because I can't imagine for any reason apart from killing a person you would need an assault rifle. In terms of self-defence, in terms of farmers, in terms of hunters, I understand all of that and they're right, but I can't imagine you going down to shoot a few rabbits out the back of a property with an assault rifle.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no reason you need an assault rifle to go hunting. Absolutely, I agree with you. And there's people on the extreme wing of the NRA who think it should be okay to have rocket launchers and tanks and have anything you want, which is really ridiculous.
Let's move on to the next topic. The American election is getting closer and closer. Donald Trump has made a few comments, as Nick mentioned, that could hinder his chance at getting the presidency, whereas on the other side you've got Hillary Clinton, who is allegedly a all-out liar. Dave, the last time you were on the show, you were talking about you liked a few of Donald Trump's policies. Are you still swinging towards Trump?
Well, certainly him over Hillary Clinton. If it were Bernie Sanders on the other side who was running against Hillary, I would vote for him over some of the other Republican contenders. But to me, it's anybody but Hillary, anybody but her. So as far as he's concerned, yeah, I would be for Donald Trump. And you're right, she is dishonest. She is a liar, and she's also a hypocrite, because you look at the Clinton Foundation, and that's getting to be a real scandal here. They've taken $25 million from Saudi Arabia, $5 million from Yemen, millions and millions of dollars from Middle Eastern countries where homosexuality is punishable by death. They want to exterminate Jews and Christians. Women have no rights whatsoever and are abused. And Hillary Clinton is taking money from these countries for the Clinton Foundation and claiming she's for women's rights. It's tremendously hypocritical.
And Nick, you're someone that's lived in America, and I know you have a deep love of politics. When you hear Dave say that, does it still make you nervous that Donald Trump can potentially rule the world within the next few months, or do you understand where Dave's coming from?
Look, I hope that Trump doesn't win, because while I understand why people like Dave might think it's a great thing, I don't think it's a good thing for America, but it's certainly not good for the rest of the world. And I mean, Dave would tell you Donald Trump's all about making America great again and bugger everyone else. But I think the broader question, and this is what I want to ask Dave, is the tragedy I think here is the amount of money you have to be a serious contender for the presidency, and you don't get good people standing up to be president. I mean, I can't believe in the world's greatest country of 300 million, the best at the end of the day we can hope for out of the president is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, both of whom have got serious personality flaws, both of whom have been caught out telling untruths, and both of whom have got a very bad public record. That's the best you can come up with? Surely not. And the problem is, and Dave, I'll throw this to you, the problem is the process is so elongated, it costs so much money, it is always going to revolve around getting someone either personally exceedingly wealthy, which is Donald Trump, or someone who has a knack for raising money from all sorts of angles, which is Hillary Clinton.
Well, all the points you just made are why people like Donald Trump here and why he's probably going to win the election in November, because he has self-funded his entire campaign. He's not beholden to lobbyists. He's not beholden to the power structure of the Republican Party. He's not beholden to billionaire donors that he's going to owe favors to once he gets into office. And that's the problem with all our politicians here. They have to spend a fortune of donors' money and lobbyist money, and then they're beholden to them, and they have to break campaign promises and do whatever they're told once they get in. He's self-funded his campaign. He's independent from all that. And he is the complete and total definition of an outsider when it comes to politics. And that's why, the Republicans hate him worse than the Democrats do. They're trying to take the election away from him, and they're trying to stop him because they know the game's over. Once he's elected, their little game of extortion and paying off lobbyists and paying off donors and doing what's bad for America is going to end come November if he gets elected.
But Dave, sadly, what you've just said is he's bought the presidency. And that's not a good thing, is it?
Well, I don't think he's brought the presidency. There's just a groundswell of support for his policy here. The people in this country have wanted that southern border closed with Mexico for decades, and they have put a stop to illegal aliens. The people in this country have wanted control over what's happening in Middle Eastern countries and the attacks on us here. And he's the first one, I think, in about 30 or 40 years who's actually brought these subjects up and at least claims he's going to be doing something about it.
But you hit the nail on the head there. He claims he's going to do something about it. You tell me. He says he's going to build the fence or extend the fence, and that's fine. I understand that's his policy. He says the Mexicans are going to pay for it. Now,
they are going to.
Well, you and I know that ain't going to happen. And
it is going to happen because they might not pay for it out of pocket, but they will pay for it in trade policies. He's going to stop. He's going to stop foreign aid to the country of Mexico. And I tell you what, if a wall gets put up there and they don't have millions of people crossing over here and sending money back to relatives in Mexico, they will write a check so fast you won't believe it to get that wall built. If they don't write the check, it's going to cost them 30 times more. So it's going to do so much damage to the country. And he's going to stop American companies from relocating to Mexico. Like General Motors.
How's he going to do that? How can you, as a government, how can you stop in a free enterprise system, in a capitalist system, how can you say to any of the companies you can't have any offshoots down in Mexico or any country? How can you do that?
Well, here's how he said he was going to do it. General Motors is going to be building a big plant in Mexico that's going to take away a couple of thousand American jobs here. And he said the first thing he would do is he wants to keep those jobs at home. He wants Americans working. So go ahead. You move your factory to Mexico. But if you do that, he's going to put a 35% tax on every single car that comes over the border here. So if that goes into effect, I guarantee you General Motors is going to keep their plant in America and keep those jobs here.
So this is a capitalist system, is it?
Nick, I'm going to give you one more point.
No, I mean, I just find that fascinating, and that here is a man who is a capitalist and a very successful capitalist, and yet he initiates a measure like that. That's not capitalism.
Well, but it's fair trade. That's what he wants to do because we're getting killed by other countries around the world, China and Japan and Mexico. It's unfair trade. I mean, they're getting all the advantage here, so he's going to even this thing up and make it fair trade and make sure it goes both ways.
Nick, we're going through an election at the moment as well. Are we going through a similar situation, obviously not as hype, but where we don't necessarily have someone who looks like an outright winner?
Oh, absolutely.
And then there's probably more people that are against one of the candidates than that are with the other one?
We in Australia, we have a leadership vacuum. We were really hoping that Malcolm Turnbull, when he took over as Prime Minister in the coalition, his popularity before he became Prime Minister was enormous. And I honestly reckon if he had taken over as Prime Minister according to his beliefs and got a whole lot of stuff done, he'd still be a very popular Prime Minister, but he's done nothing. And in many ways, he's backtracked on a lot of the beliefs, which is ridiculous. He's backtracked on a lot of the beliefs that made him popular in the first place. And what do you reckon the end result of that is? He's not so popular anymore. It's going to be really tight. I think he'll still win, but I hope he then grabs the bull by the horn and say, okay, the reason why I was popular in the first place is because of these beliefs. Let's go and act on them.
So how do you run an election? And this can be a question to you as well, Dave. How do you run an election when people are going to be voting on who they disagree with the least rather than who they agree with the most? If that makes sense.
Welcome to politics.
If that makes sense.
Well, Dave, I would argue that that's exactly what Dave has told us. He has said, I will vote for anyone apart from Hillary Clinton. So, I mean, that happens all over the world, doesn't it, Dave?
Well, this is different this time around. For the last 30 or 40 years, it's been frickin' frack. There's not a hair of difference between a Republican and a Democrat. They both believe the same things. They're both beholden to big donors and lobbyists. They agree pretty much down the line on anything, and nothing gets done. This time, people are excited here. There's a grassroots and there's a groundswell. For the first time, I think, since Ronald Reagan in 1980, there's a groundswell of support for somebody who's different, somebody who's independent, somebody who's his own man, like Donald Trump. So I think this is a different election than what we've had probably since 1980.
Yeah, I mean, Australia could do... we don't need a Donald Trump, but we do need someone who stands up for principles and say, I stand up for this, and I'm going to convince you that I'm right. And at the moment, we don't. I thought Malcolm Turnbull was going to be someone like that. At the moment, he's not.
We haven't really had anyone like that since John Howard.
Yeah, John Howard was a perfect example of that. Paul Keating was a perfect example. And Paul Keating, love him or hate him, you always knew where he came from. Paul Keating, Bob Hawke were like that.
So since John Howard, why has politics gone down the drain since then?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, Australia's had weak leaders. I mean, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, circumstances conspired against them, but they also were not strong leaders. They didn't say, I think we should do this, and I'm going to convince you we should do it. And Kevin Rudd was a perfect example. He came in with enormous good grace and blew it all.
The next one I want to touch on, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm not sure if we can get a bit of a debate out of it, but Muhammad Ali unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. His death had nothing to do with his 30-year battle with Parkinson's. It was a respiratory disorder, but he changed the world in terms of African American rights and standing up for the little people, and he was against war completely, and he's made a huge impact on the world politically and socially. When you look at and he's done it all in the spotlight, even though he hasn't been afraid to show himself in the spotlight, even when he's been suffering from Parkinson's disease. On the other hand, someone like a Michael J. Fox, who has also been suffering from Parkinson's for a very, very long time, he's kind of gone away from the spotlight. But I just looked up his foundation yesterday. Last year, if I read it right, they raised $128 million for Parkinson's research. When Michael J. Fox unfortunately loses his battle, I hope it won't be for at least another 20 years, do you think their legacy will be different, even though Muhammad Ali has spent his time in the spotlight and made an effect, whereas Michael J. Fox has spent his time behind closed doors, even though he's had a history in acting? He spent his time behind closed doors, but he's still made a huge effect on Parkinson's research, and he could change the world as well. What's the difference in legacy for those two? Because it's a different approach.
Well, that's a difficult question because they both done a lot of good work. Obviously, Muhammad Ali is better known than Michael J. Fox, and sacrificed so much in his career. He gave up the heavyweight championship of the world in 3.5 years of prime years of his career and millions of dollars based on principle, and which is something you don't see a lot of, and that's part of the greatness of Muhammad Ali. And he remained. And then, remember, in 1975, he left the Nation of Islam because he had some disagreements and he thought maybe they were too extreme and had too many violent tendencies, and he became a Sunni Muslim. And from that point on, he became an ambassador to the world. And I remember in 75, he visited Mecca, and it just opened his eyes up. But one of the reasons he left Nation of Islam, he went to Mecca, and he saw white people, brown people, Asians, and he said, oh, my God, it's incredible. People of all races and all colors are Muslim here at Mecca. And then from that point on, he became a Sunni Muslim and, the ambassador to the world that we all know now.
Yeah, look, Michael J. Fox, I think, has shown enormous courage. And in their own different ways, they highlighted the battle against Parkinson's disease. But I think what you're talking about is their history before they became victims of this insidious disease. And there is no doubt that Muhammad Ali... he was voted, when we were living in America, he was voted the best American sports person of the 20th century. So he had the great boxing and the strength of his personality. I am the greatest, I'm so fast.
So he had that confidence. He was in the spotlight.
And he had this wonderful... And then he had the courage and the ticker at the time to be one of the first public figures to stand up against the Vietnam War, and he, as Ado pointed out, suffered financially enormously from doing it. But he was on principle. He didn't think he should have to go. He thought it was a war being fought by, as he saw it, rich white people sending off poor, predominantly black people off to Vietnam to fight the war for them. He thought that was wrong. And as he always used to argue, I've got no quarrel with no Viet Cong. And he stood up, and which took a lot of courage. So all of that had happened before, course,
before he got diagnosed with Parkinson's.
Yeah, so he was one of the iconic figures of the 20th century.
Well, then could you argue that Michael J. Well, not as big as Muhammad Ali, but Michael J. Fox, and this is why I look up to him, is because he was one of the big plays in comedy and entertainment with Back to the Future. Then before that he was in Family Ties. So he's lasted quite a few decades and even generations in Hollywood. But then when he got diagnosed with Parkinson's, he virtually disappeared and worked his butt off to try and is still trying to find a cure for Parkinson's. So he has made a huge impact on the world without being in the spotlight.
Well, he had a TV series just last year. He made a comeback
for 1 year.
He had had a television series called The Michael J. Fox Show, which unfortunately didn't last long. But And I thought it, and I think the greatest thing about Michael J. Fox is he had such a great sense of humor as well. He was making jokes on that show about having Parkinson's and being lighthearted about it. And I think something like that brings so much awareness here when he says, yes, I have Parkinson's, and yes, I can make light of it at some point and make jokes about it, but I can still make a lot of money as well. And I was hoping that series would be successful because it was great to see him out there again.
So ideally the question is, when you want to make an impact on the world, is it better to be someone that's outspoken but still works hard, or someone that maybe shies away from the media but still works their butt off and can make an impact on anything, but they don't really need to be out there and be a spokesperson?
Well, it's a very personal choice. I mean, and it also depends on how your health is. And I can imagine Michael Fox has days when he just wakes up and thinks, I just can't face the world. And, you know, stays in bed all day. I mean, most men in their 50s have those days anyway, let alone if you're suffering from Parkinson's disease. So, and I'm sure Muhammad Ali had those days as well. But it's a very personal. I don't think it's up to us to say to Michael J. Fox or to Muhammad Ali, this is the way you should live your life trying to cope with Parkinson's disease. Both of them have done it differently. Both have had extraordinary careers before they fell ill. Both have done a lot to help the people who have their ailments. And you wouldn't want everyone to do the same thing all the time anyway.
Yeah, true. Dave, final comment
Absolutely.
on that one?
I couldn't have said that any better. He's absolutely right. Everybody has different ways of going about things. I would imagine if you're out there and in the public eye, you could probably maybe raise a little more consciousness and a little more money. But as you said, Michael J. Fox has raised, $180-some million. So it's it's just a matter of personal opinion and how you go about doing this.
Now, the last topic I want to touch on is the Zika virus. And the thing that's popped into my head is, well, this Olympics is going to be completely tainted with the Zika virus. Athletes pulling out left, right and centre, and still more athletes are considering whether to go or not. Plus now Russia has lost their track and field team and Vladimir Putin's having a bit of a fit about it. Should the IOC have relocated the Olympics months ago or years ago to a different country at least to a clean country where at least you can get every athlete that wants to be there can go there freely without risk?
First of all, no, they shouldn't have relocated it. From what I understand from Australian doctors, and the American doctors might be different, Dave, but certainly from the Australian doctors with the Australian team, they say the risk is very minimal and the Australian team will be constantly monitored by doctors on their team, and I presume it will be the same for the Americans as well. The risk certainly is there, but it's not that serious, and I don't think many athletes will, in fact, pull out.
But there is a risk.
Of course, but there's always a risk. Elaine, you go anywhere in the world and you can be in a risk of all sorts of things happening to you, whether it be disease, getting run over by a car, terrorism, whatever. There's always going to be a risk. I think very few will pull out. So I don't think that's going to be a major issue at all. And I would also argue with the Russians, in fact, this event will be a lot less tainted than it was in London, because in London they were clearly cheating. They took medals they shouldn't have. At least this time round we know they won't be there, so that element of it might happen.
Dave?
Well, I agree with Nick. I think the risks are low, and I think the Olympics will go on as planned, and the doctors in America are saying pretty much the same thing. The risk is very, very low, but I think Brazil might have some bigger problems to worry about. It was announced yesterday that they're out of money. The Olympic Committee, and they've gone to the federal government here. They're broke. They've gone to the federal government in Brazil and say, please give us money. They haven't completed all the facilities yet. They're out of money. And then, of course, there's also the issue of raw sewage out there in the water for the rowing and swimming competitors. And they've got a lot to worry about, because the latest test they did showed that there was still raw sewage out there, plus they're out of money. So I think that might be a bigger issue right now than the Zika virus.
Look, I agree. But having said that, of course, Dave, and you being a sports guy, you know this more than anyone, before every Olympics, it is going to be a disaster. There are always problems. I remember even before Sydney, which was universally decried as the greatest games up until that time, before Sydney, if you'd read the local Australian media, it was going to be a disaster. Nothing was going to go right. It was all going to fall over in a big heap. But invariably, these major events, they happen. Everyone gets swept up in the euphoria. They are fantastic events, and they happen 2 weeks. It's like a tsunami of sport and excitement, and at the end of it, you think, why did we worry so much?
the same thing happened here in 1984 when the Olympics were in Los Angeles. It was going to be a disaster. We'd rather not have them here, blah, blah, blah. And then it turned out everything ran smoothly, and I think it's the only Olympics that ever turned a profit financially. And the freeways were cleared. There was no traffic for the first time I can ever remember, and only time in Los Angeles. And the thing ran smoothly and beautifully, and it turned out to be a great experience.
Well, I remember the uproar when Atlanta got the Olympics, and the lead up, everyone thought this is going to be way too commercial. It's going to be the Coca-Cola Games. No, it was fantastic. It was great.
Yeah, except for the bombing out in the, except the bomb that went off without a hitch.
Yeah, that's right. And interestingly enough, that was at the time everyone was worried about that being external terrorism. It turned out to be domestic terrorism by Eric Rudolph, which and he had worries about left-wing influences in the world and abortion and all of that sort of stuff. And it's
and poor Richard Jewell. I mean, he was accused of that at first, and his life was ruined. And after his name was cleared years later, he wound up dying young, I think, from the stress of all that.
Yeah, that was absolutely tragic, wasn't it? He was someone that they just picked out of the blue. He's a little bit of a loner. He's a little bit strange. Yeah, he looks as though he could be the suspect. And unfortunately, he didn't have the ability and the support to actually tell everyone, no, it's not me, and no one believed it.
Yeah, by the time he was cleared, his life was ruined.
Oh, yeah, it was tragic.
Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure. Before I let you go, I know you're a big basketball fan. Who do you think's going to take out Game 7? Which Australian is going to come home with a ring?
I think the Warriors are going to find a way here. I know Andrew Bogut's not playing, which is going to hurt them defensively. Andre Iguodala's got the back issues, but 85% of teams, home teams in Game 7s have won over the years in the NBA Finals, and I think they've got to find a way to control LeBron. He's had 41 points in each of the last two games. They got to throw up a zone. They got a double team. They've got to keep him out away from the basket, and I just think that Steph Curry and Klay Thompson will be making a lot of three-point shots tomorrow night and bring the Warriors home.
So I know you're based in LA. Do you have any affiliation with the Northern Californian team or not?
The only affiliation I have is I'm friends with Michael Thompson, who I used to do a radio show with, and he was a 15-year veteran of the National Basketball Association and the first pick in the 1978 draft. And his son, Clay, is one of the stars of the Warriors, whom I've known since he was 14 years old. So for that reason, I'm pulling for the Warriors. But that's the only affiliation I have.
Well, that's a pretty good one. If you know someone playing in the team, that's the one you go for every time.
Absolutely.
Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on and being part of the first debate on the Alain Go Goodman Show. It was a bit complicated, but I think it went through pretty well, and I'll put a bit more thought into the next few topics. 2 out of 4 ain't bad.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I think it worked well.
Have a great evening, Dave. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.